US President Donald Trump's tariff regime ruled unlawful by the Supreme Court, removing a central policy plank of his second term. He's promising replacement tariffs will take effect within days. What's the impact of the ruling on Trump and internationally? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Tom McRae. Just last week, US President Donald Trump once again called tariff his favourite word. But on Friday, the US Supreme Court ruled illegal levies he had imposed under an emergency law a central policy of his second term. Well, since taking office, Trump has launched economic warfare against much of the world with his tariff regime. He said it was meant to restore trade balance, but Washington has since used those levies in all variety of disputes. Trump hit Canada with duties after accusing authorities of allowing fentanyl to be smuggled over the border. And India was hammered for buying Russian oil. But now it's Trump himself who's been bruised by the top US court. So what does all of this mean for the president, the US and the global economy? Is the ruling a critical blow to Trump's power, or will he bounce back? We'll speak to our guest shortly, but first, this report from Alexandra Byers.
President Donald Trump had been waiting for this ruling for months, and on Friday, it sent shockwaves around the world. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled to block some of Trump's global tariffs, a stunning legal defeat for the president, striking down his signature policy this term. He slammed the top U.S. court, calling it a disgrace.
I think that foreign interests are represented by people that I believe have undue influence, have a lot of influence over the Supreme Court.
In a 6-3 ruling, the conservative majority court ruled the president overstepped his authority when he announced his Liberation Day tariffs last year. Trump said the sweeping package, affecting dozens of countries, was meant to benefit the American economy. He used a 1977 law meant for national emergencies, bypassing Congress. The Supreme Court ruled that was unlawful. Democrats applauded the decision and urged Congress to take back its control.
Congress has the ultimate authority to impose these tariffs. I am urging, for the sake of American families, pleading with my Republican colleagues to buck Donald Trump and not allow him to impose these tariffs on the American people. Congress has the power to do it, and Congress should.
Trump has used tariffs as his main source of leverage this past year, upending global trade and long-standing alliances. He hit more than 90 countries with new duties. They've ranged from 10 to 50% and targeted industries across the board, including steel, semiconductors, and cars. Brazil, India, China, and Switzerland were among the hardest hit, along with Canada, one of America's biggest trading partners. Even close allies like the United Kingdom, Japan, and South Korea were affected. More than 1,000 major companies are suing to reclaim some of the $200 billion already paid in tariffs. Friday's ruling doesn't address the issue of reimbursement, which could take years to play out in lower courts. The decision also throws into question trade deals the U.S. struck with other countries this past year. Many included tariffs and were agreed under pressure of even higher ones. And still, Trump is defiant, pivoting quickly, imposing a new 10% global tariff on all imports into the United States, this time relying on a different law. Those come into effect on Tuesday, but only for 150 days. The political fallout from the Supreme Court ruling will last a lot longer. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Okay, let's bring in our guest now. Melanie Brusseler is US Program Director at the think tank Commonwealth. She joins us from State College in Pennsylvania. James Davis is founder and president at Touchdown Strategies, who's worked on several Republican national conventions. He joins us from Washington, D.C. And Claire Finkelstein is the Algernon Biddle Professor of Law and Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. She joins us from Philadelphia. Thank you so much for joining us here on Inside Story. We really do appreciate your time. Melanie, if I can begin with you. This has been described a number of ways. A defeat, a rebuke, a blow to the president. How would you describe it?
Well, I think in terms of the economic outlook, the effects are still quite hazy. I think that this has been a check by the U.S. Supreme Court on Trump, but at the same time, we're not seeing any sort of direct effect on the tariff rate yet, just given that Trump has pretty immediately imposed a new round of tariffs. Going forward, I think the economic outlook is going to be very hazy moving forward. Before this ruling, we had been seeing a pretty muted, protracted, and mild economic slowdown in response to Trump's policies. The U.S. economy is really buttressed by high consumer spending, and tariffs haven't really done much to affect consumption, and moreover, the U.S. is primarily a service-based economy, so tariffs only affect like 10% of U.S. GDP. But post-ruling, I think that we're going to be seeing a lot of uncertainty and chaos. From the get-go, the tariffs had been implemented in a pretty chaotic way. Trump had announced pretty broad, sweeping high tariff rates and then pulled back, and then now this ruling had declared one avenue illegal, and then Trump immediately imposed another suite of tariffs that will face certain congressional oversights. I think this first round will only last for 150 days. There are other avenues that he might pursue that would include investigations, which is a little bit thornier. It throws some gum in the wheels there. But in general, I think we're facing a kind of drawn-out saga with these tariffs. It's going to be leading right into the 2026 midterms and the start of the 2028 presidential race. And so I think that the political effects, too, will be quite striking.
Yeah, we'll get into that a little bit later in the programme. James, tariffs have been at the core of Donald Trump's economic policy since the start of his second term. I mean, he's used them as leverage against some of his closest allies as well as many of his adversaries. So where does this leave his economic and international policy, do you think?
Well, I think it's going to continue just as it was. I mean, just because they struck down the IEEPA tariffs doesn't mean there are not other avenues, as we've already seen from the White House coming out very quickly and stating that they're going to impose this 10% tariff across the board. The president has wielded tariffs quite effectively to get some deals out of other countries where he feels like, hey, we're just getting the raw end of the deal, either in a trade agreement or also in some drug smuggling aspects. We also saw it in Colombia, where he said, hey, you've got to take back these folks that have been charged with crimes back to your country. And the president said no. And he said, oh, we'll throw a tariff on you. And the president of Colombia said, okay, fine, I'll send a plane. And so, there have been some wins, and that has been part of Trump's as a feature in the way he uses the tariffs to try to strike deals. That will shift a little bit as some of the policies in which he tries to leverage these tariffs moving forward, whether that's Section 232 or Section 301, or if he goes for some of the more investigative components of using tariffs, it'll be a little slower, but some of those tools will still be in place. And so it's important to note that while the Supreme Court ruled against the IEEPA tariffs, these other avenues still exist. So I don't think it changes much. There'll be a lot of narratives around this, and certainly questions around refunds of tariffs and things like that will continue. But I don't think it actually impacts his agenda that much.
Yeah, he's, as we've heard from him since the court ruled that he's going to continue doing what he has been doing if he can. Claire, the vote was 6-3, with 3 Donald Trump appointed justices in the majority. What does that tell us about the Supreme Court's view of executive power in America right now?
So this is very interesting. The opinion was authored by John Roberts, who is very often on the side of presidential authority. And we had Thomas Alito and Kavanaugh in the dissent holding out for that authority. And what was really striking, and Justice Roberts, you'll recall, is the one, for example, who authored the immunity decision in 2024, which gave the president, in effect, so much power to say that he could not be held liable for an official capacity crime under any circumstances. And so the kind of unitary executive reasoning, the kind of reasoning that leans very heavily on foreign power for the president, could very well have been the message that Chief Justice Roberts came up with here. But instead, he went the other way, and he was very strong in saying, look, it's Congress that wields the power of the purse. And the major questions doctrine, as it's called, leads us to require Congress to say very, very clearly if they're going to abrogate that authority and take it, in effect, away from themselves and transfer it to the president and allow him to impose what is essentially a tax. And it's Congress that normally wields that power. So it's quite a striking decision from that standpoint and may signal something of a shift on executive authority. It's, as I say, a surprising decision coming from Chief Justice Roberts.
Yeah, indeed. James, I just want to come back to you very briefly, if I could, because we heard the anger from Donald Trump against these Supreme Court justices. I mean, he called them unpatriotic, those who voted against him. What do you make of that kind of attack, that rhetoric, on the court? Do you think that that's a smart political move, and how do you think that's going to play with him for the American public?
Well, I take a step back and look at what we've seen throughout the last several years, where Democrats have decried the illegitimacy of the court. They have pushed for big policies under Biden, such as sweeping student loan forgiveness, and the courts rejected those things. And they said, oh, the court is illegitimate. It's Donald Trump's. It's paid for in full. They're just a tool of his. We can't rely on them. There's no faith in the court. And they tried to use excessive force from the top and to enact these policies under the Biden agenda. And now all of a sudden, it's really rich to see within seconds of this ruling that they're now celebrating separation of powers and cheering on the court. It's just baffling to see that about face by the Democrats.
Okay, well, I guess politicians will be politicians in any circumstance.
Exactly.
Melanie, you mentioned this before. Trump's already signed a new 10% global tariff under a different law. Can you just explain in real plain terms what it will mean for everyday households? What's actually going to change for Americans as they go into the stores and purchase these goods?
Yeah, I think unfortunately not much. Going into Donald Trump's second term, many companies were expecting a tariff increase and so had begun to take measures such as increasing their inventory, having a bit more supply on hand just in case there were price increases along their supply chain. And so actually to date, we haven't seen too meaningful or calamitous an effect on consumer everyday economy inflation in the United States. When we think about the affordability crisis beyond the sort of the inflation moment coming out of COVID and the Ukraine supply shock, what most Americans are really talking about is the cost of essential services like healthcare, education, which are services and not really trade impacted anyway. In terms of this ruling, the Supreme Court didn't mention any sort of mechanism by which consumers or corporates will be reimbursed or refunded for these illegal tariffs. I think many companies are now, angling to sue the administration or pursue court proceedings to get refunds. But that said, it'll only be the major corporate behemoths that have the money and, time to wait that out to follow court proceedings. And in terms of how companies might eventually, filter that down, I think that we're very unlikely to see price decreases. A company that's raised its prices in response to tariffs is going to lower them without any sort of legal mechanism by Congress, for example.
Yeah, Claire, just on that whole refund process, Justice Kavanaugh warned in his dissent that the refund process is just a complete mess. Who actually has legal standing to claim a refund? Do we know? I mean, this is really complicated, isn't it? And extremely messy. Do you think that has been by design from the Supreme Court?
Well, that's right. The Supreme Court often leaves it to lower courts to make such application decisions. We also saw that with the immunity decision. The Supreme Court doesn't always fill in those particular details. So I think actually President Trump was right in his press conference yesterday when he said this may be tied up in courts for a long time. There's going to be litigation. But look, it was crucially important that the Supreme Court not allow the fact that there would be messy decisions, a la, Kavanaugh's comments, to influence its basic decision here, because otherwise the idea would be that any president can usurp Congress's authority and then have the justices say, well, it's too hard to reverse now, and so we're stuck with what the president did. That's not an acceptable way to sort out the relationship between Congress and presidential authority. So it can't be that it's just too difficult to reverse. And if I may, I want to point out that the major questions doctrine, which was used in this case to say that Congress needs to speak clearly if it's going to abrogate such enormous power, its power of the purse to the president, was also used when the Supreme Court decided to reject Biden's student loan forgiveness. And I think it's important to note here, and this is in pushback to James's comment, that you didn't hear President Biden calling the Supreme Court justices lapdogs and disloyal and suggesting that they were traitors for rejecting his policies. Every president is frustrated sometimes when justices don't go along with them, but he didn't suggest that they had been personally disloyal to him or that it was a personal vendetta in some way. I think that's very important to keep in mind because this is the rule of law, and presidents need to speak with respect about the rulings that the Supreme Court hands down, even those that they don't like.
James, you've been deep inside Republican. Hang on a sec, James. You've been deep inside Republican politics for many, many years now. Do you think that this ruling gives Congress an opportunity or even an obligation to try and set proper trade policy, do it the right way legally, or do you think that that's pretty much politically unrealistic at this point in proceedings?
Well, I think Congress obviously has a role that they could play in this, and certainly the president can lean in on them to try to legislate the tariffs. And so that is one option. Again, there are other options still on the table, whether you continue going through Section 232, whether you can continue going through Section 301, and then there's the investigation process, which Claire mentioned, or Melanie mentioned earlier. So those are all viable options. I will push back a little bit on Claire, because I would say, where was that when Barack Obama called the Supreme Court and Chuck Schumer and many other Democrats said that the Supreme Court was a racist relic of a society past, right? They've decried the court whenever it has ruled against them and then held up the court. And that's politics, obviously. And so let's put that in perspective a bit.
Melanie, the tariffs were hoped to raise, I believe, around $2 trillion. I mean, the Bipartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget think tank said this is very bad news and it's just going to add to the debt pile. What's the long-term economic impact, do you think, on the US economy?
Yeah, I think long-term what's most likely going to happen is a sort of broader reordering of global economic systems in response to Trump. But I think that that's kind of downstream of tariffs. It's not like an immediate near-term price increase, for example. As I said earlier, the U.S. economy is really buttressed by high levels of consumer spending, and most of our economic activity and a lot of what drives the U.S. economy is services to begin with. And so moving forward, I think that there will be effects on the patterns of global industrialization and trade relationships and the fallout of Trump's chaos and aggressiveness with tariffs. In terms of what this means for the average American, though, it remains that the issue that, trade policy, both under Trump but also under previous presidents, really didn't center the working class. And I think that moving forward into the 2028 cycle and the 2026 midterms, I think that we are going to see more progressive standard bearers entering the race and with more full trade packages and trade thinking. And I think we should be on the lookout for how trade policy can be benefiting the average American and not just corporates.
Okay, Claire, if we can look a little bit more internationally for a couple of minutes. Obviously, this has had a huge impact since Donald Trump brought these in. As Melanie was saying, the uncertainty and chaos has been going on since he came into office, and that looks set to continue. I mean, is this going to change the way that many leaders that have been hit with really high tariffs, some as high as 50%, actually change the way that they deal with Donald Trump in the US from here on in?
Well, it may restore some faith in the U.S. Because it has looked up till now as though the U.S. system of checks and balances has just been failing to operate when it comes to Donald Trump, that we just don't have our act together with regard to the different branches of government and the way that checks and balances are supposed to work. And the fact that we are capable of having internal checks and balances, that the court is actually capable of looking at a statute like IEPA and saying, no, it doesn't mean whatever Donald Trump wants it to mean. He can't usurp power under it by just calling it forth and using it to sanction us without congressional authority, distorting the meaning of that statute, may actually give some assurance to our allies that the U.S. is still a democracy.
Yeah, Melanie, if I can come to you on this, where does it leave the trade deals that have been done between the US and many other countries, or the EU, for example? What happens to those now? Because a lot of that has been agreed, and they're at a higher rate than the 10% that Donald Trump has now been forced to enact.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question. I think it remains to be seen. These trade deals didn't go through Congress, so there's no, legal authority backing them. Trump had certainly used the high tariff rates that he was threatening with this IEPA mechanism as a leverage tool in engaging countries in trade deals. I think now that that is off the table, there is uncertainty of how other countries will react. Will they attempt to renegotiate or unwind these trade deals? Already, Trump is saying that he will still use or interpret the IEPA statute to impose trade embargoes on countries. So I think he's still trying to find ways of using aggressive leverage where he can. So I think it's really in the agency of other countries, and it remains to be seen what will happen. Yeah,
okay. I guess they're all trying to process the decision as we all are. James, if we can just go back to the Supreme Court's decision and take a wider, broader view, a look at this. I mean, many had pointed to the perception that this really was his Supreme Court that's gone along with many of his policies. But is that now in question? And what other policies of Donald Trump's is the Supreme Court actually looking at that could be changed, do you think?
Well, I think the Supreme Court are going to continue to look at it under the framework of the Constitution. If you go back to the Federalist Papers, actually, Federalist Paper 48 under Madison, that puts a check on presidential powers. So going back to the very foundation of this country, we have a long-standing history, and I think that the Supreme Court will weigh all of these decisions independently of politics, independently of their own prerogative, and they will make the decisions that they feel is most appropriate to the law, to the original text of the law, because most of the justices that Trump put in place are, in fact, originalists, and they look at that original text and intent. And then they will look at the precedent as well. So they potentially overturn additional things. I mean, I worked on the Chevron deference case, which was an overturning of administrative authority and rebalanced the powers between the states, between the different branches of government, and said, hey, you know what? The administrative state has overreached here to have a negative impact on tons of industries, including small businesses like the fishermen in that case.
Right. Claire, does this mean the Supreme Court decision, do you think that means that Donald Trump has no longer been left unchecked or unrestrained? Can we read that much into it? Or I guess what I'm asking is, how significant is this ruling? And do you think it's a landmark moment or just more of a limited decision, a one-off here?
That's a really good question. I think it's a little too soon to call it a landmark moment. In answer to the question that you had for James, two very important cases that the Supreme Court is grappling with has to do with removal power, presidential removal power. What is the extent of his removal power? Does he have the ability, for example, to remove the Fed chair? And that's going to be a hugely impactful decision in this area. How independent is the Federal Reserve? And if he doesn't like the policies of the Federal Reserve and they're not going along with his, desire to lower interest rates, can he just unilaterally remove the head? Or the FCC, can he, in the Slaughter case, can he remove the head of the FCC unilaterally when it's supposed to be an independent agency? So those questions are going to be hugely significant as we go forward and really test the boundaries of executive authority. The decisions of the court in the past suggest that this case may not generalize to those. That is, the balance of interpreting a statute like IEPA may not translate to inherent Article 2 power when it comes to something like core removal authority and when it's not a particular statute that's under consideration.
Okay. Melanie, if we can come to you to finish off this episode of Inside Story, what exactly will you be looking for to happen next? I mean, we've obviously talked about the uncertainty that this decision has thrown up. Is there anything that's going to give us an idea in the days and weeks ahead about, what we can expect a little longer term?
Well, I think that Trump has already made clear that as long as he remains in the presidency, he will use every tool at his disposal to attempt to impose tariffs on other countries. So I think that is a mainstay. I think that the long-term effects of these tariffs will be quite murky just because there has been, again, this chaotic policy implementation. A lot of consumers and businesses are quite uncertain. And I think that the only way to get certainty will be through the political process. I think, as I said earlier, we're approaching the 2026 midterms, which Republicans are expected to lose. We're already starting to see standard bearers going into the 2028 Democratic primary cycle, presenting new visions of trade and economic governance, both domestic and global. Already, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez recently did a tour at the Munich Security Conference, as well as visiting with social democratic parties in the German context, articulating a vision of trade and global economic governance premised on supporting working classes in both the U.S. and abroad. And I think that remains to be seen how that will be filled out going into 2026 primaries. It seems like that will be a major touchstone on how to be rebuilding the U.S. presence in the world and what a trade and economic policy can look like that supports working people.
And I guess all eyes will be on the State of the Union address on Tuesday, which Donald Trump is due to give. Thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Melanie, James and Claire, we really do appreciate it. Well, thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Tom McRae, and the whole team here, goodbye for now.